All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I am thrilled to get a chance to present this topic, which I'm very passionate about. And we got some great numbers on the call today. So it seems like there's a lot of enthusiasm around this topic for sure. As we're letting people kind of trickle in, I would love for you to share, where you're coming from in New York, what you teach, or what your role is in education. If you are in a support staff kind of role, maybe what brought you here today or what you're excited to learn. And then if anybody has joined me for a previous session, I always like to begin with a warm-up activity, kind of like an icebreaker. I do this to really model the importance of starting time together with conversation and check-ins, again, kind of modeling that social emotional learning focus. And today's topic is one I know we can all benefit from. So if you have strategies that you have found helpful for striving, I won't say achieving, I know for me it's a work in progress all the time, but if you have found strategies you think are helpful in striving for a healthier work-life balance and you want to share what's worked for you in the chat window, I would love for you to answer this check-in because basically I want to steal all your wonderful ideas for how you're finding work-life balance. So introductions, where you teach, what you teach, maybe what brought you here today, and then any strategies that you feel like are helpful in striving for that work-life balance. So I'm going to mute myself in just a moment. Just a little housekeeping before we dive in. I do have a resource document for this session, and I will put it in the chat window kind of repeatedly, since I know there are going to be lots of people who come late or accidentally close the tab. So don't worry if you accidentally kind of navigate away from it. I'll make sure to keep throwing that resource document link into the chat window. Also, for those of you who are attending and wanting to get that CTLE credit, your information is automatically captured when you join this session by Zoom. So within 24, 48 hours or so, you should get that information sent to your email address. So no need to kind of share that with me. And if you have a question, if you could send it to me either in the chat window as a direct message, it's a little easier for me to field questions that way than with the raised hand or with the Q&A, because you guys don't actually have the opportunity to have your volume on this webinar. So throw questions, please don't hesitate if you have a question, but throw them in the chat window. And that's what I'll be kind of monitoring as we go and hopefully answering those. And if you want it, because there's a lot of activity in the chat, if you want to send it to me as a direct message, feel free to do that. All right, so as people are checking in, kind of sharing where they're coming from, what they do to strive for work-life balance, I'll just kick off the session. So we are here to explore how we can ensure equity and access for English language learners across learning environments. My name is Dr. Catlin Tucker. If you have questions between now and my next session next week, which is all about social emotional learning, please feel free to reach out on Twitter, Instagram. I would love to connect, brainstorm, share resources. So don't hesitate if you leave today's session with a wondering or you have a question specifically for me. All right, so thank you for all of you guys who are chiming in with that kind of welcome activity, sharing where you're from, sharing your work-life balance strategies. You can continue to do that and kind of throw those into the chat window as we dive into today's session. And I am putting back in the chat window, which I will do repeatedly through our session today, just a link to a resource document. So just to give you a sense of what that's all about. So we are going to cover a lot of ground today, and I wanted you guys to walk away from our session with all the resources that I thought would be helpful in you taking some of these ideas that were interesting and playing with them. So I have up here a link to my slide deck for anybody who wants to have that larger for accessibility or who wants to kind of revisit my slides after today. I have broken up the resource document by kind of the sections and the topics we'll be covering. And within each section or topic, I have curated a list of blogs, resources, templates, things like that, that I think will be helpful in kind of letting you guys take something you're excited about from today and put it into practice. So just know that this is here for you as we move through today. So if you're seeing kind of templates in my presentation or strategies that you're like, ooh, I love that, I want to do that with my students, don't worry, you have access to all of that in the resource document. So we're here to talk about the needs of kind of English language learners. And if you guys want to throw kind of the big needs that you see when working with students in your classes into the chat window, feel free. I would love for that to be as vibrant as possible during our time together today, since we have a real range of grade levels, a range of different roles being represented in today's session. So when we talk about the needs of English language learners, definitely kind of tailoring that instruction to their language proficiency, right? Making sure that instruction is accessible, that it's within their kind of zone of possibility to access information and actually execute specific tasks what we're asking them to do. So really thinking about where is their language proficiency level, is what we're presenting to them, what we're kind of the information, the content, are we presenting it in a way that they can actually access? We want to give them the same access to content and curriculum as their peers, but we also know that that means we may have to be really thoughtful about how are we differentiating, how are we scaffolding and supporting our second language learners in accessing grade level content and curriculum. They need lots of opportunities to practice speaking, listening, reading, writing in English. And are we making space for those regular activities to happen in our classroom? Obviously, we want to create really safe learning environments because there's a lot of risk involved with kind of using a second language in a classroom. Culturally responsive teaching methods, like, are we really trying to understand our students' cultures, their beliefs, their values, really connecting with them and their families? And then also kind of just supporting that adjustment to a new language, potentially a new culture within the fabric of our classes. So really taking these needs to heart and thinking about what can we do proactively as educators to best meet these needs. So one of the things I like to kind of focus on when I talk with educators is really there's this design part of our work that we do as teachers, architecting learning experiences for specific groups of learners. And we talk about designing equitable learning experiences that can be incredibly challenging in the traditional whole group teacher-led model, right? So when I work with my graduate students, we talk about the difference between equality and equity. And equity is something that you hear about a ton in education. Of course, it's a big priority, but I think sometimes we talk about equity, but the design of learning experiences don't necessarily create equitable kind of situations for learners. So when we think of equality, it's that equal input, like all students are getting the same input. They have the same access to resources. They have the same access to, teachers' time and energy. So if that's kind of like an equal input, when we talk about equity, I'm really clear with my students that what we're talking about is this acknowledgement that each individual learner needs a specific input to reach a particular output, right? So for example, if you think about it, some students need much less of our time and energy resources in a classroom. They can navigate tasks without as much support, more independently. And then you're going to have students who need a lot more of your time and energy resources in a classroom. But when we're leaning on that whole group teacher-led design, we're not usually freed to give individual and small groups of learners the specific inputs that they need to reach that particular output, that, standards aligned learning objective. So for me, I think fundamentally we need to have a conversation about how do we shift from that whole group teacher-led instructional design, where the teacher's focus tends to be on transfer of information, right? They spend a lot of time at the front of the room, kind of transferring information in the form of lectures and mini lessons. And students tend to play a more passive role in those classes because it's very teacher-centered, teacher orchestrated, right? Even if we're not talking the whole time, we're still in the front of the room kind of orchestrating the parts of the lesson. And we're not free to sit with individual or small groups of learners to meet their specific needs, to make sure they're getting the input they need to reach a particular output. And we know when we're talking about second language learners, they may need much more than other students in their same class in terms of that energy and time and support and scaffolds. So really what we want to think about is what are those instructional models that will allow us to, at the very least, plan for small group interactions, if not individual interactions with learners. So we want to shift from that very teacher-centered design to a much more student-centered design, where the teacher's focus is not on transferring information, but instead on facilitating learning, right? How can we design lessons that allow us to work with small groups to differentiate instruction, to differentiate modeling sessions so that students can try strategies and skills at a level that's going to work for them, where we're using language and supports that work for them? Can we dedicate more time to supporting learners as they're practicing, giving them real-time feedback as they're working so they understand what they're doing well, what they need to adjust, where they might need to spend more time? And then also having conversations about student progress. Can we build in more regular kind of conferencing? So as I said, this is kind of that student-centered design makes it easier to meet individual learners where they're at and provide those inputs that they need to reach whatever the output is we're working toward. So often when I present with teachers, we'll talk about blended learning, right? Kind of this active engaged learning online combined with active engaged learning offline. And how can we leverage blended learning models to better support students and meet them exactly where they're at, and to give them, quite frankly, more control over their experience, whether it is the pace at which they move through an activity or complete a task, whether it's the path or a decision that they make about how they want to do something. So one of the blended learning models I spend a lot of time working with teachers around is called the station rotation model. And the benefit of this model is that teachers can strategically group learners in a class and move them through a series of learning activities. There's typically 3 different types of stations. There's a teacher-led station, an online station, and an offline station. And you can have multiple online stations, multiple offline stations. It totally depends on, the length of your class period, how many, students you have in a class, and how many you would ideally like in a group. But the goal is to free the teacher to work with small groups at that teacher-led station, better meeting their specific needs. So the benefits of the station rotation model is you're blending that online and offline learning in a physical classroom. It can work on a hybrid schedule or completely online as well. But for those of us working in a traditional classroom, it gives us that opportunity to leverage technology strategically and create these small learning communities inside a larger class. So if you've ever been frustrated feeling like your classes are just far too big, which is how I have felt about every class I think I've ever taught in the public school system, this is a great way to kind of group students so they feel like these smaller learning communities working together, navigating tasks together, accessing peer support. It makes it much easier to differentiate instruction and provide the necessary scaffolds and supports to learners navigating different tasks, We can encourage that communication, collaboration, practicing those language skills in a smaller group dynamic where maybe it's a little less scary to take a risk and articulate ideas in a language that's not your first language. We can group students by need. We can group them by skill level. We can mix up groupings depending on the purpose of the rotation. And as students move through learning activities at the non-teacher-led station, they have more control over the pace at which they move. So they're not being ushered through an activity on a teacher timeline necessarily. They should have a little more flexibility around that pacing. And really the kind of pillars of high quality blended learning, which are incredibly helpful for second language learners, is student agency. So really thinking about how do we give students who English is not their first language meaningful choices in terms of how they navigate tasks so that they feel more confident in their abilities. 2, how do we use these blended learning models like station rotation to differentiate more strategically and consistently, right? Really thinking about what word choice we're using, what scaffolds we have on hand, what problems or prompts or texts we're using, really making sure that it's going to be accessible for our learners. And then third is just control over pace, right? It's very hard when navigating a language that's not your first language in an academic setting to feel like you're being pushed through learning activities at a rate that is uncomfortable for you, right? So where are we giving students a bit more control over the pace at which they navigate particular tasks? So blended learning can really provide English language learners with more opportunities for personalized practice. So if we're using online programs for reading development, for vocabulary attainment, that can be very helpful for them. Differentiating instruction and providing more targeted individual and small group support. Providing digital resources that can be easily translated and or adapted to meet their specific needs. Hopefully, we're also building in more of that social learning where they have opportunities to engage in collaboration, kind of interactive activities that promote that language development. And then also the ability to access digital platforms and resources so that teachers are better able to monitor individual student progress and even give them more timely feedback as they're working on specific tasks, practicing skills and strategies. So we'll start by kind of thinking through the language development piece of this, like how are we really kind of promoting speaking and listening, reading and writing. And I'll frame some of this in that small group dynamic, because as I said, I think all of these things are going to be a little less scary and intimidating in a small group dynamic. Yet when we have students in small groups, we obviously are asking them to kind of take more responsibility for their behavior, for their decision making. And so those are things that we have to cultivate in order to set them up for success. But what I really love about the small group format is that, or that, you know, in the station rotation, is that we can use the variety of stations for so many different language development activities, right? So in that teacher-led station, we might do differentiated direct instruction. We might have them kind of engaging with us in an interactive modeling session. We might have them practicing something that's new, but we're there to kind of guide practice and provide corrective feedback. And also for our learners who are just getting comfortable engaging in conversation with their peers, we can even use a small group teacher-led time to facilitate small group discussions, helping learners to cultivate those skills they need to engage in conversation. But also it's an opportunity for us to collect that formative assessment data. How kind of where are our students as speaking and listening kind of speakers and listeners? So building that all into the teacher-led station can be incredibly helpful in terms of us meeting the specific needs of our English language learners. The online stations can be used for personalized practice with an online program or adaptive software. We might want to really have students focusing on those listening skills and have them listen to a podcast and then draw a sketch note, kind of surfacing what they're learning in the podcast, or creating a timeline or a flow chart or a concept map. We might have them doing some collaborative work online in a shared space like Google Slide Deck or a Google document, or self-pacing through a video lesson. So there are lots of different ways we might use this online station to allow learners to kind of engage with information, to self-pace through practice, etc. The offline station is a really wonderful opportunity to get them doing everything from reading on their own or reading with a partner, kind of engaging with text in an active reading way. So giving them some options for how to actively read. Writing to learn assignments, really encouraging them to think about their learning and reflect on it and write in response to content prompts. We might have them filling out concept maps or graphic organizers to organize and surface their thinking, and even engage in some vocabulary practice. So I want to go through and kind of highlight some strategies we might use to really drill down into supporting our learners in these different small group learning activities. So the first is that teacher-led station activity number 1, which is just differentiated direct instruction with a gradual release over to the learner. So a lot of teachers are very comfortable with the I do, we do, you do, right? A lot of textbooks, a lot of curriculum is written that way. I usually encourage my teachers to kind of insert a pairs do, and I'll tell you why. So at your teacher-led station, if you are trying to get students kind of onboarded to a strategy or a skill, you might start by introducing that strategy or skill. So for example, let's say I am focused on the reading strategy of asking and answering questions about a text, and I have a small group of 6 students in my teacher-led station. I'm going to explain what the strategy is, and then I'm going to read out loud, and I'm going to model that strategy for my students so they can hear it, they can see me doing it. Then the we do is where we transition. And as a teacher, I'm probably still reading out loud, but then I'm pausing at strategic moments and inviting students in the small group to jump in and kind of practice the strategy. And for my second language learners, I'm likely going to have some sentence frames on the table, kind of helping them to articulate their thinking. One question I had about this event, I'm curious about this. I wonder if, why would blank, right? Giving them some kind of on-ramps into the practice session. Once we've had a chance to do the we do as a group, then I'm going to pair students in my small group. So maybe there's only 6 students. Now we have 3 pairs. And they continue practicing with a text at a level that is appropriate for them, right? So I'm strategically pairing students and I'm letting them continue to practice with peer support, no teacher support. At that point, I'm just listening, I'm observing, and I'm trying to identify who from my group is ready for independent practice and who needs more time with the teacher. So the reason I like the pairs do is it helps me to, again, further differentiate, not just by choosing text at different levels, having different levels of support, but also realizing, hey, these 4 students are ready for independent practice, but you know what? These 2, they need to spend more time with me, going through another example, doing more kind of together we do practice before they go to the independent practice. So this is one way to structure a small group teacher-led station or instructional session to really better meet the needs of the students who are with us in that group. The second strategy I love, particularly for our second language learners who might not feel necessarily as confident in a particular, especially like writing skill, like writing in English is really, really tough. They really need more in the moment feedback. And what we know about feedback is it can have an enormous impact on student achievement. You know, John Hattie has done all of this research around visible learning, and he talks about how important feedback is. And he does this really, or he provides this really interesting kind of 3-question approach to feedback. The first question being, where am I going? And so it's really important that all of our students, but especially students who might struggle with a particular skill, know what the learning goal or target is. What is it that they're trying to accomplish? What are they working toward? We want to make sure all our students have clarity on that. Then when they're actually working, this is where that real-time feedback can be incredibly powerful, right? And that answers the question, how am I going there? So as students are working, we're giving focused, actionable, process-based feedback. Is there a part of their work that they need to dig a little deeper? Would we encourage them to make a connection, try a different approach? And then the third question, which Hattie says is maybe the most important, is where to next, and getting our students to articulate, based on the feedback I got, this is what I want to work on, this is what I want to revise, this is what I want to focus on next. So actually using the feedback to create a kind of a clear sentence of what they're working toward or what's going to happen next. And again, for our students who need additional support, providing a sentence frame for them to complete that statement so they have true clarity about what are they going to do with the feedback and how do they plan to continue improving. So whether you're an elementary teacher and you have students at your like kidney-shaped teacher-led table and you're like kind of carouseling around to give them feedback on their work, or whether you're a secondary teacher and you're kind of diving in and out of digital documents, giving quick focused feedback on work in progress, I would love to see teachers dedicating as much time to feedback as first instruction, because it's when students are trying to apply a strategy, apply a skill, where they often trip, they fall, they make mistakes, they need support. And feedback truly is how students feel seen and supported in a classroom, particularly our students who need the most support from us as their teacher, that most input in order to make that progress. Now, when it comes to offline station activities, like I said, there are just a bunch of different ways that you can really engage learners in that kind of self-directed or kind of social learning. And one of my favorite strategies is a strategy called reciprocal teaching. And reciprocal teaching is often around text. So a lot of the conversation is around reading, but because there is so much media and because some of our English language learners might be more successful at times diving into a video that is about content level information, or trying to kind of cover concepts, events, and things, you can use this strategy for any type of media. But the idea is it is this kind of inclusive, guided multimedia comprehension strategy, really trying to get students to think critically about whatever media they're engaging with to learn. So whether they are reading, viewing, listening to media, we want to try to get them doing that actively. We want to engage that critical thinking so that they're applying comprehension strategies to that information. And then hopefully also developing those language skills by engaging in conversation with their peers about that media, really practicing that speaking and listening kind of side of those skills. So the reciprocal teaching protocol, the traditional kind of classic approach, has 4 roles. So the idea is that a group of 4, and because we're talking about this in station rotation, I'm going to show you how to do it with a group of 6. But let's say you have a group of 4, each person in the group would get a role. And so before they ever do this independently, we obviously want to do this as a class. We want to onboard students. We want to talk about what does it mean to be the predictor? What does that look like? As a teacher, I want to model it. They need to practice. Then What does it look like to be the summarizer? Let's model it. Let's practice. So there is an onboarding process that has to happen, but hopefully we get students proficient enough with the reciprocal teaching protocol that we can give a group a text, a video, a podcast, and they can use this protocol to work through the text, the video, and podcast to really extract deeper understanding from it. Now, as students engage with each other, again, this is where sentence frames and language supports can be incredibly helpful in guiding them in having these conversations. So I was just working with a 7th grade history teacher, and we were talking about using reciprocal teaching with her students. She has a lot of second language learners in her class. And so for about a week, we were onboarding them to each of the different roles, and we would do a fishbowl where a group would practice a role and the rest of the class would observe and take notes, and then we'd talk about it. So they had some practice. So that eventually, when we were able to put them into a small offline group with a complex text or a really meaty video or podcast, they could take their role and use it to engage in a higher level conversation about that media. So we ended up creating a 6-role reciprocal teaching tool where each person in the group selects a role, and she could either assign it or the students could select. It's totally up to you whether you kind of let them choose a role, whether you give them a role. And in the beginning, they keep that role through the entire exercise. So we told them every 2 paragraphs, if it's a text, we're going to pause and you guys aren't going to engage in a conversation about the reading, using your particular role as a lens. And you can see we've even built kind of sentence frames into each role. So the summarizer, the questioner, the connector, they all have a sense of what would my contribution to this conversation look like, sound like. So again, it's about helping students to work together to kind of pull the pieces of a text, a video, or a podcast apart and really talk about it. And not just read the whole thing or watch the whole thing and talk about it, but read a little, pause, discuss. Watch a little, pause, discuss. So they're constantly engaging around the text, the video, or the podcast, whatever piece of media you're kind of using with them. And so I included this and some other resources in your resource document for anybody who's curious about looking into the roles, the kind of support your particular learners might need to be successful. Another idea for offline station activities is around vocabulary attainment and practice. So we know our second language learners need a lot of vocabulary development and practice. And how are we building those routines into our classes on a regular basis to get them working with subject area specific language, high frequency words, academic vocabulary? All of those are helpful to pull in a regular or into a regular vocabulary practice. So one strategy is kind of leaning on that Frayer model and having students, for each of their key words, kind of go through and think about how would I put this word in terms of definitions in my own words? Like, what makes sense to me to use as a definition? What's an image I can draw that's going to help me remember what this word means? What is a synonym? Something that means something similar to this word that I'm familiar with, and an antonym, something that means the opposite that might help me to remember this word. And this might be something students do on their own. You might have them do it with a partner. You might give them a word bank of 5 words and ask them to choose 3 to kind of work through in a Frayer model, kind of building in some of that meaningful choice and agency into vocabulary practice. Another way to build in agency is to think about giving all students the same list of words, but really letting them decide, how do I want to work with these words? What would be an activity that would challenge me to kind of use some of these words or play with some of these words to help reinforce my understanding of them? And that's where choice boards can be incredibly helpful. Choice boards are great because they really tap into some of the psychological needs that students have to be motivated, right? They have agency and autonomy to make some key decisions. questions. The fact that they get to decide how they want to play with the vocabulary means that they're likely to feel more confident in their ability to complete the task as well. And you can even build in some of that relatedness or connection to a community by allowing students to partner up and work together on a vocabulary activity of their choice. When it comes to offline station activities, there are so many different kind of ones that we can talk about, but I wanted to highlight one more around discussion. So we've talked about reciprocal teaching with media. We've talked about vocabulary attainment and practice. Now, the third one is around discussion. Obviously, one of the big challenges when we're working with students where English isn't their first language is just getting them chatting and talking. Like, how do we get them excited to engage in conversation with each other? And I know that part of the reason that's so hard is because it's very scary to take that risk as a learner, to kind of, one, share your ideas and hope you're on the right track, but two, to formulate your thinking in a language that isn't your first language. So how do we do that? Really supporting students throughout the process. So one of the things I encourage teachers to do is don't just group students and tell them to chat about a particular topic or give them a list of discussion questions. Instead, let's think about how we can support them through the process and build in that agency, build in that meaningful choice into the process. So first, I always encourage my teachers, do kind of like a discussion, warm up, reflection, self-assessment. So ask students to reflect on, what are my kind of pet peeves when I'm having a discussion? Like, what tends to kind of bother me? Other things other people do, right? So for me personally, like, it's hard when I'm in a discussion and people aren't making eye contact or they're having a side conversation. Then ask them to think about, what are they like in a discussion? What are their essential traits as a participant, right? How do they tend to behave in a discussion? And so it gets them thinking about, well, I tend to be shy, or I tend to talk a lot, or, lots of awkward pauses make me uncomfortable and I tend to fill the space. I think the benefit of starting with a reflective activity, a self-assessment of some kind, is that students start to identify what they do well, what they need to work on, and they can share with the group when they get into a group what is hard for them in a discussion. So hopefully they can all be a little bit more aware of each other and their needs and their traits and their pet peeves. Then I know teachers like to give students discussion questions, but I would also encourage you to have students write a couple questions of their own. What would they like to chat about? What are they confused about or wondering about? It gives them an opportunity to start to personalize the discussion to topics of interest and topics of curiosity for them. Then they engage in the discussion, and I'm going to share with you a discussion technique choice board. So that way, again, you can kind of build in some student agency into discussion, because not all students or groups are going to be comfortable engaging in the same type of a discussion. So if we can show them, here are different ways to engage in academic discourse, which one would you like to kind of join that group, or as a group, can you decide which discussion technique or protocol you want to use? And then at the end of the discussion, I would always ask students to reflect, hey, how did I do in this discussion, right? Like, what did I do really well? What do I need to work on? What support might I need to continue developing? I think self-assessment reminds students that your participation in discussions in this class and your speaking and listening skills are something we take really seriously, and they're something that you're supposed to be doing, right? It's your responsibility to participate in these discussions. And I got the question, like, is it okay to group students at different levels together? Absolutely. I think especially when I'm designing a station rotation with a teacher with a high level of English language learners, the question is there a benefit to having students in groups by skill, ability, language proficiency? Sometimes the answer is yes, and often that's dictated by what's happening at the teacher-led station, but sometimes the answer is no. And I think there's a lot of value in those mixed skill level groupings, mixed language proficiency groupings, so students have that benefit of peer support, because there's going to be kids kind of along the spectrum of proficiency in terms of a skill or language. So it's a great question. So the choice board you guys have in your resource document is actually larger than this. It has 6 different discussion techniques on it. So the ones you can see in front of you are like everybody in the group has a role, so they can really focus on engaging in the discussion through the lens of their role, tends to give them some purpose and accountability. The second one is a fishbowl. And even with small groups, even if you have a 3 and a 3, like 3 people in the inner circle, 3 in the outer circle, or 4 and 4, the fishbowl technique can be really interesting to have a small group kind of working through some discussion questions while the outer circle is listening, observing, taking notes, and then really has an opportunity to kind of share, what did we observe? What went really well? What seemed to kind of be challenging about the way that a group engaged? And then there's even some kind of more alternative approaches like graffiti team time, where students are responding to discussion questions in writing and passing paper around for our really shy students, or our students who are very anxious, or students who might need a minute to process their thinking. So I'm going to throw this resource document back into the chat window for anybody who did not get it or came in late after I had shared it. So that's that resource document. And like I said, underneath language development, I have that discussion technique choice board. You can make a copy of it, you can edit it, and like all the resources I have related to things we're talking about are on that doc. Okay, so for the offline station, or the online station, excuse me, online station activities, obviously you might be using platforms, personalized learning platforms, online adaptive software platforms. You might be using things like Quizlet or quizzes, to kind of get students reviewing and working with their language. But there's also a lot that we can do with video-based engagement. So I love the platform Flip, which used to be called Flipgrid, for a range of different purposes. First, it's really helpful for capturing things like read alouds to assess fluency. Having students just respond to questions so we can hear them speaking in English can be incredibly, it can provide a lot of formative assessment data. We can provide a verbal pathway to respond to questions or demonstrate their learning, so that our students who are not as confident as in their writing yet have a way to accurately demonstrate their learning. So I was working with an English teacher, and she wanted to remove barriers for her second language learners. And she had them kind of analyzing this short story that they had read. And the piece was, she had it in, I think, 3 different lexile levels for her group. And she wanted them to kind of analyze something. And for most of her career, that would have taken the form of writing. And I said, what if we gave students the option to write or record, right? Giving those students where the writing might present some serious barriers to truly demonstrating their learning, and giving them another way to do that. And it was really interesting to see the students who chose the video recording, just their depth of ideas and how much insight you got into their ability from that video recording. So we can get them explaining a process, surfacing their thinking. We can get them sharing their prior knowledge and making connections about topics, texts, issues, subjects. We can have them engage in a video-based discussion with their peers, right? A lot of kids struggle with real-time, rapid-fire discussion. And so where are those other spaces where we can make sure they can have their ideas and their thinking heard? And then also reflective kind of practice, getting kids thinking about an assignment or a routine or a project or an assessment, and just reflecting on how it went, what they struggled with, what they felt went well, where they could use additional support. So just thinking about what are the benefits of that possibly leveraging that video. So when we talk about making sure students can access the content, I think when we talk about differentiation, we're really trying to kind of make those teacher moves to get closer to giving students what they need to access the content, process this new information, and then hopefully create things that demonstrate their learning. So differentiation, if we look at it through those three lenses, can also be really helpful in better meeting individual and small groups' needs and making sure they're getting those inputs that will help them reach a particular output. Because really that design work that we do, I like to compare it to the work of an architect. We are trying to design student-centered learning experiences, but in order to do that, to kind of sketch a blueprint that will position students to do the work in our classes, we have to know who we're designing for. We have to have a sense of their skills, their ability, their language proficiency, what are their specific needs and preferences as learners, what barriers might exist that would present or prevent them from accessing information or participating in a learning experience, and how do we help to remove those barriers with meaningful choices and agency? And what specific supports and scaffolds will learners need to navigate a particular learning experience? So these are all things that we want to have in our minds as we're designing lessons and sequences of lessons. And I think often what gets overlooked in that is the role of data. Like, how are we collecting data and using data to differentiate more effectively and strategically? So when I work with teachers and we're going to design a lesson, what I really want to know is, where are students starting? Have we given them a pre-assessment? Have we given them a diagnostic to understand where are they beginning in their learning journey? Because learning isn't like lining up for a race. You know, they don't start in one spot. They're starting all over the place because they have different skills, abilities, past experiences, language proficiencies. So let's try to figure out where they're starting so we can design learning experiences right out of the gate that attempt to meet learners where they're at, right? Utilizing blended learning models like station rotation to group students based on what we've identified as specific needs or skills from a pre-assessment or diagnostic. Then as they're working through lessons, how are we collecting formative assessment data to kind of understand how quickly or slowly they're progressing, how effective particular lessons or learning experiences were. You know, we want to be kind of checking for understanding and collecting that informal data so we can make adjustments, so we can continue to differentiate instruction, models, and supports to really prepare students for what will ultimately be like the summative assessment. So really using data strategically in our design work so that we can differentiate and meet small groups of learners and individual learners where they're at. So when we think about differentiation, it's looking through the lens of, how are we differentiating the content or how students access information and skills? How are we differentiating the process or how they understand or make sense of the content? And then how are we differentiating products or how students demonstrate and or communicate their learning? So when it comes to content, it might be choosing texts at different levels of rigor and complexity. It might be giving students the option to read and listen to an audio track. So for example, in my 9th and 10th grade English language arts class, I would regularly have second language learners who, when they were given the reading test assessment, they would kind of test into anywhere from the second to third grade band, 4th, 5th grade band. And so a lot of the like novels we would read were not accessible. And it wasn't until I started using StudySync, where I had audio tracks for my excerpts and my short stories, that they could actually listen and access those texts. So how can we make text accessible? It may even be allowing students to choose, do I think I'll be better at kind of accessing information through a piece of like a reading, a digital text, a video, listening to a kid-friendly podcast? What's going to work best for me me as a learner. Some teachers who are using video instruction, you might use video instruction to allow the bulk of the class to self-pace through an explanation, and then pull students who need more support, including your second language learners, for live small group teacher-led instruction that is more scaffolded, giving them access to things like more demonstrations and models, or even reteach for those students who need it. I think these things are beautifully pulled into kind of the station rotation we talked about. And again, if you're not differentiating consistently, starting with that teacher-led station and really thinking about grouping students based on diagnostic data, targeting instruction for specific needs or skills and abilities, adjusting word choice, models, scaffolds, using problems, prompts, and texts at different levels of rigor and complexity, and providing different groups of students with different levels of support, right? Because not everybody is going to need the same amount of support from us, the same amount of our time and energy resources. So making sure we're really thoughtful about how we give individual and small groups exactly what they need in a lesson. Differentiating the process could be as simple as, do you want to read or work on your own with a partner as part of a small group? Like, how helpful would peer support be in this? Tiered activities where everybody's focused on the same kind of task, but they're engaging with it at different levels of readiness and complexity. It might be thinking more flexibly about time on task, really embracing kind of variable timing and allowing students more or less time to complete a particular task. And then also those scaffolds that we use, like graphic organizers, concept maps, guided note templates, word banks, opportunity to work with manipulatives. All of those can also help students kind of take that new information and help contextualize it, make connections, make meaning from it. So really embracing the different supports and scaffolds that would be helpful for your particular learners at your grade level and in your subject area. And then finally is differentiating the product. Really thinking about what are the different ways that students might be able to demonstrate their learning. And that's where my example about writing versus a video recording can be helpful. Really thinking about meaningful choices that might appeal to learners with different interests, different strengths, different learning preferences. If they're working on a larger product, can we make sure we're building in class time to allow students who need more support to check in with us, get feedback, have a conversation about their work in progress, and even maybe at times giving them options of, do I want to work on this on my own? Would I prefer to have a partner and peer support in this? So another one of the resources that I included is this universally designed for blended learning kind of action and expression board, which just has a bunch of different options that students might choose from to share their learning. So if you like some of the options and not all of them, you can make a copy of the choice board. You can eliminate the ones you don't like. You can make it a smaller board. You can add ones if you have ideas that you think would appeal to your learners. But it's really about giving them that meaningful choice and hopefully removing barriers so that everybody feels like they can demonstrate their learning in an effective way, in a way that's going to be representative of what they know or what they can do. The last piece of this is that idea of kind of cultural responsiveness and being really aware that our learners are coming in with this whole background that is so beautiful and powerful. So it's the students' culture, their lived experiences influence how they understand and make sense of the world and themselves, and are an integral part of who they are as learners. So we want to be weaving that into our class to hopefully make the content, the curriculum, their experience in our classes as meaningful as it possibly can be. So what I would love to invite you guys to do for this final section, anytime you feel inspired to add something to the chat window, is just if you have strategies you've learned that you've used that you really like that have helped you to learn about your students' cultural backgrounds, their values, their beliefs, norms in their families and communities, I would love to have you crowdsource those, throw them into the chat window, just to kind of supplement the few activities I'm going to highlight, since I know this is a focus for a lot of us, particularly at the beginning of the school year, but I really think it's something we need to be tapping into throughout the length of the school year. So the more strategies we can kind of crowdsource, the better. So feel free to throw those in at any point during, this section. So when we think culturally responsive teaching, some of the things that are critical to doing this well is, one, really getting to know your students and their families. And again, a lot of this work happens in the beginning of the year. So maybe thinking about how do you want to start next year, really focusing on this work of forming relationships with students and getting to know about them and their families. Designing activities that help you to learn about your students' cultural backgrounds, their beliefs, things that they value. Really being aware to integrate into the curriculum, even if it's not in your adopted curriculum, can you pull in literature, history, important figures and people, content that really represent diverse experiences and the diverse perspectives of your students? How can we make sure that they can connect with and relate to some of the curriculum and the components of the curriculum? Creating really inclusive, welcoming, respectful learning communities, especially when we talk about supporting our second language learners. Like I said a couple times today, they really take a lot of risks in classrooms as they use a new language in their learning. And so how do we make sure these are spaces where they're not going to be ridiculed, where people aren't going to be teasing them for making a mistake, but instead the whole class understands that learning is risk-taking, it involves failure, we're all going to make mistakes, and that's how we learn. Tailoring instruction to account for students' cultural and linguistic backgrounds, and really trying to prioritize that voice and choice in our classrooms, encouraging students to express themselves in really meaningful and authentic ways. So the reason I asked you guys to throw your strategies in the chat window is because there are so many different ways you can do all of these, but I just wanted to kind of pique your interest with a few ideas. So one is, a lot of us start the school year trying to get to know our students in terms of languages spoken at home. Do you have device access? Do you have hobbies? But could we integrate questions like, what's your family's cultural background? Are there cultural traditions or customs that are important to you and your family? What languages do you speak at home? Do you have favorite foods? Does your family have specific dishes that are special or meaningful? What types of music are played in your home? What beliefs or values are important to you? How might they influence your life or your approach to learning, right? Really digging into questions that are not those surface questions that we might ask on kind of an information form, but something really driving us to learn more about the cultural background, the beliefs, the values that students are coming into our classrooms with. So being as creative as you want with these questions. And I did link to my template if you want to make a copy of this form and then adjust it, asking questions that are more appropriate for whatever the student group is you're working with in terms of age and the word choice and all that. There's a really great circle activity that's described by Modern Classroom that's, the Modern Campus, excuse me, that's called Just by Looking at Me. And the idea is that you sit in a circle and students get to know one another on a deeper level, form some connections as members of a learning community, and the teacher will kind of throw out prompts or questions, or it could even be an incomplete sentence frame for students to respond to. So my name is, I'm from, I have blank siblings. One thing you cannot tell just by looking at me is, I believe. So you can have lots of fun with the prompts, but the idea is that you go around the circle and each student shares a response to whatever the question or the sentence frame is. So they are starting to get to know each other on a deeper level. I also love the thinking routines out of Harvard's Graduate School of Education. And a few of them can really be helpful in this kind of identity exploration. So this one is called the Who Am I? And there's an explore, like, who am I? How has my identity developed? A connect, who or what am I connected to? Identify, if I want others to know who I am, what would identify me? How would I describe myself? And belong, where do I belong? Do I have a sense of belonging to a group or a place? Which I think is a really beautiful way to get kids thinking about their identity. And then last but not least is finding those resources online where we can pull texts and information that might really kind of relate to our students' lived experiences. So if we're going to be delving into identity, or we're going to be reading short stories, can we lean on a platform like Common Lit and find short stories written by authors of different cultural backgrounds so that students have options to choose one that would be most interesting or relevant or aligned with their own personal experience? These are great ways to supplement what might be kind of a adopted curriculum where you don't have as much choice around what students are reading. But even in traditional subjects, like having students research important figures from their own cultural background who've contributed to things like sciences and math and the arts, literature, and really tapping into what they know about their culture and surfacing that. So in terms of our wrap up, I just wanted to let you guys know I have one more session on the calendar. We're about to add a bunch more, but next week on May 15th, we're going to be focusing on how to create an SEL classroom. So if social emotional learning is something that's on your radar, you really want to spend more time kind of working toward and investing in next year, we'll be getting into the kind of CASTLE framework and talking about how you develop self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. So I hope if you are around, you will join me for that. And I am going to, just one more reminder, if you have questions after today about any of this content, please feel free, send me a tweet, send me a note on Instagram, ask a question, request a resource, whatever it is you're looking for. I would love to stay connected, meet your needs after today, because I know often these are just like a fire hose of information and you might have questions that bubble up after today. So thank you guys for being here. It was wonderful getting to kind of share this time and space with you. I will look at the chat window. I'm going to mute myself. And if there are any questions that got asked that I didn't answer, I will answer them. And again, remember, anybody who wants that CLTE credit, we have your email solved, kind of gets them when you log into the webinar, and you should get communication about 24, 48 hours with the recording and the information for your related to your CLTE credit if you showed up live today.